My guest today is Dr. Matthew D. Nielsen. Matthew is a conductor, composer, baritone producer, and sound engineer based out of Los Angeles. As a conductor, he's led performances in notable venues across the United States, England, and South Korea. He's also the founder and artistic director of the Utah based professional choir Brevitas. In addition to leading Brevitas, Matt has performed with many notable ensembles, including Seraphic Fire, the Canara Ensemble, the LA Master Chorale, and the Bach Collegium San Diego. As a composer, Matthew has received numerous commissions, including from the Barlow Endowment for Music Composition, and his music is published with Peters Edition, Walton Music, and the Santa Barbara Music Press. Matt is joining us today here to talk about his new book, The Technique of Choral Writing. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me again. It's great to be back.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. You're totally my go-to source for choral information. As you know, you and I have a lot of choral performer friends, a lot of choral conductor friends, and you're the one that I go to when I want to know about choral writing. So I'm thrilled that you wrote this new book and put all of
Yes.
your knowledge into one place.
Yes. This has been something that I have been. Well, let me first show the book. This is the book, The Technique of Choral
Honestly,
Writing. It's probably going to be backwards on the video, but.
yeah, I have my copy too.
And you got your copy too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
love it.
I'm so glad it came in the mail for you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is something that I had been thinking about actually for well over a decade. I thought about it actually when we were doing our master's program at BYU. And it was mostly because of a couple of things. One of the things was I actually got this book, The Technique of Orchestration by Kent Kennan and Donald Grantham. And I learned so much reading this book. I don't work with orchestras like you do or like most composers do. And I got that book and I learned so much. It just was a really great introduction to the orchestra, introduction to the basic principles and the limits of each instrument, and so much institutional knowledge about the individual parts of the orchestra, how they work as a group, and then how they work as a whole. I learned so much, and I was jealous that I didn't know of any book like that for choir. I didn't know of any sort of institutional or any sort of, I didn't know of any sort of book that sort of gave that same knowledge, but on the choral sense. And the only thing that it really had was the 2 pages here in Appendix D, where they talk about writing for voices. And it's only 2 pages where they talk about voices, which, as you can see, there's, a lot more to say than what's on 2 pages. I'm really glad that they spent 2 pages talking about it, but that just wasn't enough. And I just thought, I wish that there was a book. I wish that someone would come out and write a book, about all these things, because I'm getting these scores from lots of composers and lots of student composers and even professionals. And I think these people don't understand how the voice works. Or these people don't understand how to voice tenors and basses together, or just something like that. I wish that there was a book that they could use. And I thought about like, well, what if I did that for my master's thesis? And my advisor advised me against that. It was very smart. And then when I went to USC, University of Southern California, I thought, well, maybe I can do this for my dissertation. And my advisors also advised against that, which was also very smart. But this thing of like, there has to be a book, there has to be something like that, so that composers can go and have a reference, and people can have this place to get this information. I still felt that needed to happen, and it wasn't happening. And then I talked with you, Joseph, about, hey, do you think that this is a good idea? Is this something that's needed? Is this something that's wanted? I think that it's wanted, but I also am like a choral conductor and a singer, and of course I think it's wanted, but like, what does the composer community think?
And I'm thrilled to have this book now. I think that it's a really marvelous addition to the library of specialized knowledge that composers need to know in order to write well for the different ensembles. Now, this actually relates to the next question I wanted to ask you, which was in your introduction, you mentioned some common misconceptions about choral music. Can you elaborate on these and explain how your book addresses them?
Yes,
Yeah.
the book addresses a lot of things, and one of the things that it addresses is just an overview of what is in the book. I talk
Mhm.
about setting words. I talk about an introduction to the human voice and understanding how the voice as an instrument works, and then an introduction to sopranos, altos, tenors, basses, and other voices like countertenors, children's voices, cambiata, just so you can understand a little bit of the differences between them and how their parts work with each other. And then I talk about vocal different types of vocal ensembles, and then I talk about, of course, how to voice for the choir, how to do texture for the choir, how to do divisions for the choir, how to do choir with instrumental collaborators, and then different extended techniques for the choir, different special effects that you can do with voices, and then, of course, things to do specifically with how to engrave for the voices. But I mean, that's just an outline of what's in the book. The thing about what are some misconceptions? One of the misconceptions is about how to set words to music. And a lot of people don't understand sometimes about like metric stress versus like pitch stress, and understanding that this isn't really like a principle that you can sort of get around. Another big misunderstanding is I want to write for a symphony orchestra. I want to write for an opera chorus. So I'm going to go study music that the king singers are singing as a way of learning about how to do that. And understanding that like the choir is not an ensemble, it's a family of ensembles. And they are as varied as a one person per part ensemble and a giant symphony chorus. These are all choirs, but the way that you write for each of these types of ensembles and all of the different ensembles in the gamut, they're not the same. And you have to make special considerations for different things. That's a big misconception. Another misconception is the biggest misconception, and the one that really, really grates on a lot of singers, is a lot of people, when they talk about like choral ranges, they show the lowest pitch and they show the highest pitch. And a lot of people look at that and they think, okay, all of this is fair game all the time. Everything here is at my disposal without any limitations. And that just can't be further from the truth. You know, just as it is with like writing for the clarinet, understanding that like, okay, certain registers of the clarinet are better in certain applications. And also there are breaks in the voice. Breaks in the clarinet, just like there are breaks in the voice. Or just understanding, oh, you know what? Actually holding out like a pitch on the clarinet forever, no, they're going to run out of breath. The same thing needs to like be taken into consideration with the sopranos. And also understanding that the voice fatigues in different ways at different times. That's something that I don't think that I have seen put to print. And that's like, these are all, I mean, I could go on. There's so many misconceptions about how to write for choir and how to write for the human voice. And I get very excited talking about it.
Yeah, well, which is why you're here, which is awesome.
Yeah.
What I find is interesting about this too, right, is that like most instruments, like piano, clarinet, harp, like in order to play these things, it requires a lot of specialized knowledge. And I'm not about to suggest that singers don't need to be highly trained, but singing is a thing that like most musicians are capable of doing, even if they do it really poorly. You know, joining an orchestra is a little bit of a challenging thing for a lot of people, but just about anybody can join an amateur choir. And so it's kind of remarkable to me that it seems like it's something that composers often don't think of. They think, oh, well, I could never sing because my voice isn't as good as, you know, Phil and great singer here. And so they just don't have the experience of singing. I don't know if there's a question there. I'm just sort of like responding to what you're saying. And it's just like,
well,
it's interesting.
Yeah, and actually,
the time to learn.
Yeah, and you do bring up a very important point, and it's something that I do talk about in the book, is that not only are there different types of choirs for different sizes and different, you know, functions, religious choirs, educational choirs, professional choirs, but then there's also divisions with, you know, singers' abilities. And you make a really good point, which is that, yes, there are choral ensembles for everyone at every single level. And if you want to go join your local community choir, you can. If you want to join your local church choir, you can. If you want to put your child in a children's choir, you can. There is a choir available for every person at every level and at every sort of level of engagement, every sort of level of interest. And I do talk about how to write for those ensembles as well, write for the sort of like untrained voice or the lesser trained voice, and then also how to deal with trained voices. And that's actually another big misconception, is that sometimes I see music written for voices that are highly, highly, highly trained, but the commissioning ensembles is a community chorus where they don't have trained singers. And I do talk about and address those differences of how to write for trained singers, how to write for untrained singers, things to take into consideration, things you can do a division here with these kind of choirs, but if you're doing it with an amateur choir, I would limit it or eliminate it entirely. And you also bring up a really important point, which is that there are many, many, many choirs of many, many different levels. And I think one of the reasons why composers in some ways haven't bothered to learn sometimes is that they always think that, like, oh, choirs are amateur by default. And for a long time, for many, many, many hundreds of years in this country, singing was an amateur sport. And there were no big leagues, or there were very, very few big leagues that were available to either work with or for singers to work with. And that has changed dramatically in the last 30 to 35 years. And there are many, many, many more big league choirs, big league vocal ensembles, for lack of a better word. And there's a new opportunity for writing vocal music of really, really, really high quality for singers, as long as it's in an idiomatic way.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
for sure.
I
I
also
guess
I'm sorry if like I'm sorry if I'm going like a million miles a minute. I have so many thoughts, and I am just like I'm like, oh, this leads to this and this leads to this and this, and so like forgive me, and please tell me if like you need me to keep to like just one subject at a moment, because I have had too much caffeine this morning.
no, it's all good. I love the enthusiasm, and I hope that what listeners are getting from this is that not only are you bringing in this book just this really deep knowledge of how to write for choir, but also that there are all of these possibilities that when you go through a typical composition course at university, when you take something online, that these deep possibilities tend to get glossed over. Or if you're lucky, it's like, cool, I learned how to write 4 parts in my music theory class. And any professional musician who's taken a music theory class understands that the music theory classes are for beginners. This isn't beginning to scratch the surface of harmony and counterpoint, let alone writing for choir. So I think I'm not surprised that you're excited about this, just because this is a resource that, as discussed, hasn't really existed before. Um, I actually want to circle back to something you were talking about a little bit earlier. You gave us the summary of these are the different topics that are going on in the book. How did you decide what to include, and was there anything that you had to leave out?
Yeah. When you and I first were talking about this, and I was going to you and saying, is this a good idea? Is there an audience for this? Is there a market for this? And you were very enthusiastically saying, yes, please write it. We need this. We want to write for vocal ensemble. We just need more information. We don't even know, like, we have gaps in our knowledge that we don't know how to fill. You and I and another friend of mine, Jules Pegram, who also has a doctorate in composition, I had conversations with both of you about what questions do you have about how to write for the voice or how to write for choirs? What's a question you've always had? What would you like to learn more about? What's a question that you would like to ask, but maybe you're too afraid to ask? And you and Jules gave really, really, really good answers about why do choirs, when they have an a cappella piece, why do choirs mess with the key? Why do they go to neighboring keys? Why do they do that? Or one question that both of you were really curious about was how do I deal with vibrato? How do I talk about it? How do I, and that was actually something that I never really thought was important to talk about, but that was a question that both of you brought up, and that made sure to get a section about vibrato in the book. And you both asked questions about, actually it was Jules asked specifically, how do I write for opera chorus? And that was something that I never really thought of, was like, well, okay, that's actually, yeah, that might be a good thing to talk about. One of the reasons why I talk about different types of choirs, but then also like how to work with instrumental collaborators. And I was talking with you, I was also talking with another friend, Jeff Perola, who also has a doctorate in composition, about, I think I was probably a year into writing the book, and I asked you and Jules and Jeff, hey, I have a section on instrumental collaborators in this other chapter. Do you feel like that should be its own chapter? And all three of you said, yes, absolutely, that deserves its own chapter. And I was like, okay, that really informed a lot about what went into the book and how the book got organized and how books got its own chapter. How did this become its own chapter? Why isn't this stuck with this chapter? Or why are these separated? And all three of you, talking with you, really informed like about what information went into the book. Because I had lots to say, but understanding, okay, but what do people have questions about that maybe I don't understand, or maybe that I'm not thinking about? I take a lot of this information for granted. So understanding, okay, what's the big question, and what are these needs that people feel like they can't quite ask? And that really informed a lot of that. And as far as like, did stuff end up on the cutting room floor? Yes. at least 2 whole chapters didn't make it into the book because they involved information that I felt actually a little bit weak about and that needed a little bit more shoring up from me before I was ready to talk about it in an authoritative way. Specifically, talking about choral music as it relates to more popular genres like a cappella, or talking about gospel choir, or talking about, what was the other genre?
Yeah.
Classical crossover, which is not all that far removed, but it's something that I have had little experience with. And I felt like I needed to owe it, I owed it to the audience and the reader to dig more deeply into it. And I just didn't have time to do that. There was so many other things that I needed to do to make the book a good product that like I just said, you know what, this will go in a later edition. There's also portions in each chapter where I feel like there's a lot more to say about this. I don't feel like it's necessary in this edition. This should come in a second edition, this particular topic. And even certain paragraphs where I talk about something and say like, oh, this actually merits more to speak on. It's not totally necessary for this edition. That will come in another edition. Yeah, there were a number of things that didn't make it into this book that I would want to make sure that they get into a later edition.
Yeah, well, I don't think that waiting for this later edition is gonna, I look forward to it.
Yeah,
However,
yeah,
I still need to
I want to, yeah,
happen. It's
like
still exciting.
the information that's in here is going to be really, really, really helpful for a lot of people. And just because I don't talk about a cappella music doesn't mean you can't get anything out of this. There's actually another really good textbook that just went into its second edition. A cappella arranging 2.0 is what it's called. That's a good book. And I put that as a source in here because I did consult that source and found some interesting information in there. If you want to do like a cappella pop music, that's actually a really, really good resource to do. And that's one of the reasons why I felt okay leaving it out of my book for a little while, because there already is another good resource for that genre of music.
I actually want to circle back and share a story because I think you'll find the story interesting. I think listeners will as well, and get your thoughts on it too. So when I was when we were freshmen at BYU, I was taking the Vocal Beauty Boot Camp with Clayne Robinson.
Clayne
I was
Robinson.
there with all the other opera singers. And when Clayne was teaching us how to sing in an opera chorus, he had this one line that I just thought was so memorable. And I'm curious here, take on this, which was because one of the singers was asking Clayne, he's like, Dr. Robinson, how do we deal with balance? How do we do blend? And he's like, in opera, you win.
Yeah, there's a lot of merit to that. Yeah, in opera you win. That's a good way. I've never heard it said that way, but that's really funny. And that actually sorry. That actually does come up a little bit in the book. How that's one of the things that makes opera chorus different is that individuality is individual vibrato is highly valued in many of those opera choruses. Doesn't mean that your opera chorus has to be in that late romantic vocal aesthetic, but yeah, that very much is something that is valued in opera chorus and a number of other choirs as well, is making sure that like the individual singer could stand out on their own. There is something to be said about when everyone sings out with their full voice, that it will balance together anyway. And that's the idea, is that you're all singing out with your full voices together. I mean, that was something even that like in BYU Singers, when Ron Staley, when they were BYU Singers was singing The Panther from Animal Crackers by Eric Whitacre. And, the very first opening sections of The Panther is like a leopard, except it hasn't been peppered. He was basically like, I want you all to sing like an opera chorus. I want you all to sing with your individual voice. I don't care. I don't want you to think about so much. Like, it's obviously sing in tune, but like you are singing as an individual at that point. And when you hear that recording and when you hear that in person, like it really hits you in the face. So yeah, that idea of like in opera, you win. That is kind of the mentality.
Yeah. So, going along with what you just said with your experience in BYU Singers, you've sung, of course, with them, fabulous college choir. You've sung with all these other really wonderful professional groups. You've led your own professional group. How is this really triple perspective of both being a singer in these great choirs, being a conductor, also being a composer? How has it influenced your approach in choral writing and the advice that you give in the book?
That my career in all of these ensembles, whether it was BYU Concert Choir, BYU Singers, USC Chamber Singers, all the way to singing with Seraphic Fire, LA Master Choral, Bach Collegium San Diego, Canara, they have all given me an amazing opportunity to really dig into really fantastic repertoire And these conductors, they choose fantastic repertoire. They don't choose stuff that doesn't work for the choral voice. They don't choose stuff that doesn't work for the ensemble. And so you get to work with and see, okay, how does great vocal music, how is it constructed? And as a singer, one of the amazing things about being a singer as compared to being, and one thing that I genuinely feel sorry for orchestra members is that singers get to see the full score all the time. They are seeing everything, whereas individual members of the orchestra are only seeing their part. Obviously, it's for practical reasons. There's no way that you could give a whole score to the flautist and expect them to do a good job, or to not like flip a million pages during a performance. And that's one of the privileges of being a choral musician, is being able to see the full score all the time. So you get to see not just your own part and how, how that writing gets to work well in your voice, but you also get to see, oh, how does it work well in the alto's voice? How does it work well in the tenor's voice? And how does it work well together? You get to see so many great examples. And when you're in rehearsal and you're doing this together, obviously when you're singing, you're concerned about your own part and making it sound good. But when you're not singing and you get to hear other sections rehearse, you get to really dive deep. Okay, how does it sound? Oh, that sounds really good. Okay, what's happening on the page? You get to do that all the time. And that's one of the huge benefits. And one of the reasons why I say in the book, if you can, being in a choral ensemble gives you all of that, the time to really study that and to be able to hear sometimes many times, okay, what's working and what doesn't work. And, going through different choral ensembles, you do come across pieces that don't work so well in the human voice, and you get to find out why. Why doesn't this work well in their voice? Like, oh, what does that look like on the page? How is that constructed? Okay, keep that for as an example of what not to do. And as a conductor, of course, you are looking at the whole score entirely. You are trying to figure out, okay, like where are the pitfalls? Where are the pitfalls that are going to come up? What are the things that I need to be concerned about? What's going to be tricky in the alto voice? And recognizing, oh, this is going to be tricky here, or like, oh, this is going to be tricky with the tenors, or like sometimes you're in rehearsal, you're like, okay, this section is not tuning. Why not? And you get to go back and really, really analyze, why is it not tuning? Oh, because of this, or because of this, or maybe it's because of this, and you get to think of solutions. And as you're thinking of solutions, you're storing away, okay, if you want sections to sing in tune, you want sections to sing well, this is what to do and also what not to do. There's so many opportunities for study as you are working not just as a singer, but also as a conductor. Yeah, you get so many opportunities to analyze and just hear immediately, does this work? Does this not work?
That's awesome. And so, I mean, a lot of this is coming from the side of, okay, we're doing the practical job of making the sound. What is the experience like of being the conductor, of being the singer? I want to like turn that around just for a moment too, because you've included a chapter on engraving choral parts. Why is that technical aspect important, and how can good engraving contribute to a successful performance?
So that's a very good question. I as I told some of my colleagues, both singers and conductors, that I was working on this book, all of them, without exception, volunteered without even me asking, hey, what do you think I should include? All of them spoke up and said, I hope you tell composers to write legibly for us. I hope you tell composers to make clear, legible scores for us, which you think would not be an issue in the age of Sibelius and Finale and Dorico. But it comes up all the time. And one of the things is that even still with some of these musicians, they will not do underlay of text properly. They won't put the syllables where they need to be. And there's a little bit of confusion. And a lot of composers also don't realize that in our music, slurs are confirmations of the text underlay. They're not meant in the same way that you would, for a piano or a violin or a wind instrument, a string instrument, or a wind.
Interject there just really quickly?
Sorry.
Pianists are the worst whistlers. Sorry to all the pianists out there, but like the pianist's conception of what a slur means has like no relationship to like any other instrumentalist. It's just
and that's the thing. That's the thing. A slur in string music means something different for a woodwind instrument or any wind instrument, and it means something different for a pianist. It also means something different for choral musicians, and what it means for us is different from everyone else. Just like for a pianist, like a slur is different than like everything else, and not seeing slurs being used in like other ways or ties being used in other ways is very confusing to us. And also like not seeing like certain like dashes or extenders in the text to indicate like this is how we want the underlay to be. And also like putting dynamics like underneath the bar. There's certain things of like how do you do things specifically like with the text in mind and making sure that it remains legible. There's so many times when we just see a score and we just think this is amateur hour. This is not They don't understand what we need specifically in our music.
Yeah, well, and something I would add to that, another problem that composers run into when they're looking at choral music is when they're looking at these old editions, it's leading them down. Like, because one of the old conventions used to be, it's like every individual note, if they're singing a different syllable, we're going to break all of the beams
Yeah, we're
for
going to flag all the eighth notes, all the 16th notes with different syllables. That is actually a very good point.
Yeah.
Is that music engraved before 1980 did follow an older convention, and I do talk about that in the book and how that older convention is no longer acceptable. And I also did maybe something maybe a little controversial, which is in my book I have many examples. I have actually over 200 musical examples in my book, and many of them were published and still printed in those old conventions. And in the book, I fixed it for some of those examples. I updated a lot of the examples, and at least one proofreader told me that I shouldn't do that. And I pushed back very hard against it and said, no, I'm showing good examples of what we do now. So, but yeah, you do bring up a good point about like how older music does have older conventions, and we don't do a lot of that anymore. And we don't do that with slurs didn't mean the same thing. We did flag every eighth and 16th note for different syllables. We don't do that anymore. Another convention we don't use is we don't use the tenor clef. We don't use the soprano clef for different voices. We've modernized all that. So
Well, I think the thing about all those C clefs is there are going to be plenty of musicians who are perfectly happy to never see a C clef in their life. So probably safe there.
yeah, honestly, that's one of the great things about choral music is that we just use treble and bass clef now. That's it. That's it. You know, and a suboctave treble clef, which is not hard at all.
Yeah. So throughout the book, you provide suggestions for continuing study. How do you hope readers will use your book as a springboard for further learning and development in choral writing?
Yeah, I am hoping that the exercises and specifically like the listening list, and calling it a listening list actually was not is maybe not the best term to apply for that. I really meant like a study list where I want you to see the text, or sorry, I want you to see the music while you're listening to it. I made those things in mind because I wanted to lead the reader to keep asking questions. Even though I have talked about it and I've explained it, it's still better to learn by doing. It's also better in some ways to learn by application. I could talk about what makes a soprano voice sound good, and I give examples. I put those things in there hoping that in the hopes that students will go to those examples, listen to them and see how they work and see how they sound in the alto voice or how they sound in the bass voice, how they sound in the baritone voice. Why does this work? And seeing good examples and then inviting students, go listen to these other things and see how they work here. Pointing out specific examples of go listen to, I think in one of the voices about either about divisions, the chapter about divisions or the chapter about voicing, I think I mentioned specifically go and study Rachmaninoff's All Night Vigil and look and see how they work with texture. Look and see how Rachmaninoff works with octave voicing, see what he does with this. And I also said specifically, go study Joby Talbot's Path of Miracles and see what Joby does with solo voices. He is very good on how to work with solo voices, how to like bring, how to like, I mean, how to work with different voicings with the 17 parts he's working with, but specifically how to bring out solo voices. I think that Joby does a great job of doing that.
That's awesome. Well, what I think is cool too is that you mentioned Joby by name. I don't know if you know him personally, but I know that you know many of the current choral composers, and so I think it's so cool that you're writing this and you studied with more and Lords. You've sung in these things, and so like the contemporary practice, these are very much your people, and so you're giving like an inside look at what are professional choral singers, professional choral composers at the top of their game actually doing, which I think is
Yeah.
so cool.
Funny you should mention Martin Lawrenson, because yes, he was my teacher and he gave me a nice little blurb for my book, as well as Tarek O'Regan, who's also a friend. He was very kind and gave me a blurb for the book. Yeah, I felt very strongly because the last time that there was a book like this written, it went out of print in 1980, and we haven't really had a book like this that talked about choral voicing that was up to date since 1980, and that means that we don't actually have anything in those previous textbooks that had Morton Lordson in there. Morton Lordson wasn't publishing music yet when those books were printed. Eric Whitaker hadn't been publishing yet, who honestly transformed the choral world in a way that few other composers did. I think Morton Lawrence and Eric Whitacre, honestly, like their popularity really transformed, really were a huge influence on choral music, as I think is Eric Eschenwald's now. But yeah, I felt it was very strongly I felt very strongly that I had to have examples from previous epochs, Romantic period, Baroque period, Classical period, Renaissance period. But I felt like it was also really important to have a lot of up to date examples of really, really good choral music. So I put in examples by Judith Bingham, who I think is one of the most talented voicistrators, I guess, for lack of it. She's one of the most talented composers that I'm aware of. She's one of my favorite composers. I also felt really strongly about putting in music by Abby Batinas, and I felt like putting in music by Terrica Reagan and Gabriel Jackson, and putting in music by Jocelyn Hagen, people that are making a mark on choral and vocal music today.
Well, I think that that's one of the most remarkable things about the choral literature, because I think that you could make a really strong argument. I could make a really strong argument that even though a lot of Western music history classes starting around, well, by the time they get around to like 1800 or so, they're like, oh, and now we're going to focus on instrumental music exclusively with occasional forays into opera. But I would make the argument that Western music is fundamentally about choral music. Like even so much of this instrumental music, even like if you want to know like how Beethoven was thinking about music, how Debussy was thinking about music, you don't understand it unless you understand choral music, because that is the root along with keyboard music. Those two things are the roots of how it is that composers learned how to write music.
Yeah, and it's important to point out as well that Beethoven's favorite piece of music was Handel's Messiah, or at least it was one of his favorite pieces of music. At least one of the most inspiring to him was Handel's Messiah. And I think you do make a good point, is that Western music was absolutely founded in vocal music, and we study vocal music when we study the Renaissance because that is the most abundant genre of music during that time period. And so you are studying Mise Papa Marcelli by Palestrina. You are studying Lagrime de San Pietro by Lassus. And yeah, as you go on, it does sort of get overshadowed by a lot of symphonic music because the symphonic music is incredible, right? And not to take anything away from that in the opera music of Wagner, but as we get into like this resurgence of choral music in the 20th century, and especially in the late 20th century, yeah, it's important to still keep in touch with things like Martin's Mass for Double Choir, which is a masterpiece of music, not just choral music, but it is a masterpiece of music in general. To keep in touch with other masterpieces of music like Vaughan Williams' Dona Nobis Pacem, or the Britain War Requiem, pinnacles of 20th century music that involve voices in some capacity.
Well, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of a story. Another one of our mentors, David Sargent, when he was studying at Eastman, he went to his composition teacher and he was like, Professor, I want to write a piece for orchestra. And the professor's like, cool, go write a choral piece. And so he writes a choral piece, and then he comes back, and the professor's like, awesome, write another one. And so then after writing like a series of like at least half a dozen choral pieces, finally his professor's like, okay, go ahead and write an orchestra piece. I just think that there's something about being in touch with this choral tradition, the things that it enables you to engage with, but also the constraints that it puts on you, is just so empowering for composers.
Yeah, I agree. There is something really, really, really wonderful about starting with four-part harmony, with studying with like chorale realizations and studying the four-part chorales of Johann Sebastian Bach. There is something really, really important to recognizing phrasing, recognizing the construction of form, and understanding like how harmony works with what is in many ways, for many of us, like I know you and I both started with congregational singing. We started with four-part harmony, and that's sort of like our first introduction to music. At least it was for me.
Yeah.
Other people, maybe not so much, but I think that there is something really, really helpful with grounding yourself in that familiarity. And I think also understand. I think the more that you also write that choral music, like the way that Dave Sargent's professor was, the more that you write it, the more you realize, oh, there's so much extra to learn beyond just the four-part writing, and there's so many other things. And then you start to go into the motets of Johann Sebastian Bach, and you realize, oh my goodness, there's so much to learn about voicing, there's so much to learn about character, there's so much to learn about texture, there's so much to learn about division in voice, and there's so much to learn about it. Yeah, I could study the Bach motets for the rest of my life and just still learned something every single time.
That's awesome. It's about time for us to wrap this thing up. Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to finish with just one final question. Um, Looking forward into the future of choral music, what do you see? So this book is a timeless resource, but where do you see choral music going in the future?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that choral music, vocal music, is going to be with us forever, just as it has been with us forever. Now, what that may be shaped in the future may morph. Are we going to continue to have choral groups that we can all sort of gather together and sing together? Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's going to endure. What is a concert going to look like in 100 years? That's a good question. It probably, considering what it looked like 100 years ago, it's probably going to look something similar. What are going to be the trends in choral music? I mean, I think that's going to be something, I think that's probably that's probably what's the most interesting that will be the most interesting thing to observe, because I talk in the book about special effects and extended techniques and how there's been a really big interest in exploring a lot of these extended techniques and making colors of the voice that are not the traditional bel canto sound. You mentioned actually what are some other misconceptions of choral music, and that is that one of the big misconceptions of choral music is that it's monochromatic. And that is if you are only dealing with the human voice in a bel canto like classical technique. And there's been a big interest in, okay, what if we make vocal music with sounds other than the quote beautiful tone that we've been using in our studios and in our recitals and in our concerts? What if we start bringing in other sounds and other colors and other timbres and other aesthetics that maybe haven't been welcomed in the concert hall previously? That's a big thing right now. Is that going to endure in the future? I think it's going to be around for a while. I don't know what it's going to be like in 100 years, but I think it's going to be around for a while. I think that we're just scratching the surface on that. I do talk about like one of the big things in choral music 30, 40 years ago was choral music with pre-recorded audio recordings and having like things with that. And that was big in the late 70s, early 80s, and that's kind of died out since then. We still do it occasionally, but having that in art music, in choral music at least, it's not as popular as it once was. Maybe that will come back. Maybe that'll be something, these hybrid performances between recordings and vocal ensembles, maybe that will make a reappearance. Working with electronics, microphones and amplifiers and special effects like delay pedals with vocal music, I think we're still in the avant-garde stage of that. We're still scratching the surface. I think that may find wider appeal in the future. I don't know. That's a good question.
Well, it's exciting to see what the possibilities are. And in the meantime, I'm excited for people to get this book in their hands. So, where is it that people can get a copy of this and tell us more about it?
Yes, so you can find it on Amazon. I've also seen it's popped up in a couple of booksellers on Abe Books or ABE Books. I don't know how to pronounce it. But I actually am going to offer your listeners a special link to get a discount on the book. So if you would like a discount on the book, there will be a link posted with the video and the podcast or in the description or wherever you're going to put it, Joseph, a link for a discount. So if you want to pick it up there, you are very welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's awesome. And for anyone listening, and if you're interested in writing choral music, I would highly encourage it. Going along with that, if people have questions, they want to reach out to you. I mean, so I always listen to this in podcasts. And I think to myself, "Oh man, this person is so famous. They're such a big deal. They never want to hear me." But like seriously, like if people have questions, they want to reach out to you. How can people get in touch?
You can go to my website, mattnielsen.com, MattNielsen, mattnielsen.com, and you can see more of my portfolio there. And there's a little contact button where you can write me a little note, and I get all of them sent to my inbox. So if you want to get in touch, feel free to reach out.
And listeners, as you can see, Matt and I love nerding out about this stuff. And so if you want to nerd out about this stuff, it's going to be the easiest thing in the world of being like, Matt, tell me more. What do you like about Poulenc? And it's just
Oh
a
my
full sentence.
claw. Talk about. Okay, I will just say, I'm going to make a bold statement right now. Poulenc's greatest music is his vocal music. Like, does he write incredible like ballets? Yes, of course. Like, does he write incredible orchestral music? That organ concerto, amazing. Like Figure Humain, that is one of his greatest. That is his masterpiece in some ways. But
See, I have just proven my point. So anyway,
I
anyway,
think it's also, yeah, it's I think it's something that like the listeners do need to know that like you and I will absolutely nerd out for hours, whether it's on the phone or it's like in person. You and I will nerd about like about vocal music and classical music and like all of this music. We will like we don't need a podcast to do
we
this.
need
Like
it.
we can absolutely do this. Like just yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, come join the party. Come nerd out with us.
Come join the
Um,
party.
so anyway, thank you, Matt, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I look forward to seeing more people see this book and hearing whatever it is that you're up to next with your choral conducting and composing and all the things.
Thank you so much.